probably heard the version where a bunch of European guys sat around a map of Africa in Berlin and just colored it in, like a board game. This country's mine, that one's yours, pass the wine. That's the meme version of the Berlin Conference. And it's wrong in a way that's honestly worse than the myth. Nobody drew borders in that room. Not one line. What actually happened in that building on Wilhelmstrasse between November of 1884 and February of 1885 was something quieter and honestly more useful to the people running it. They didn't divide a continent. They agreed on the rules for how to divide it later without going to war with each other over who got to do it.
To see why that distinction matters, you have to look at somebody it happened to. And I want to start with a man most people have never heard of because his story is basically the whole conference in miniature.
His name was Jaja. Before that meeting in Berlin even started, he was already running one of the most successful trading operations on the West African coast. He'd been born into slavery, worked his way up through the canoe houses of the Niger Delta, and by the 1870s, he'd broken off and founded his own kingdom, Opobo, built entirely on palm oil. And he wasn't some minor local chief. He was cutting deals directly with European merchants, setting his own tariffs, and refusing to let British trading companies bypass him and deal straight with the producers inland. He controlled the choke point, and he knew it. That's the part people skip. Jaja wasn't waiting around for history to happen to him. He was a savvy operator running actual trade policy years before Berlin, and doing it well enough that British firms were furious they couldn't get around him. So keep him in your head, because the system that was about to close in on guys like Jaja got its rulebook written in a room he was never invited into. Bismarck called the conference, but he wasn't the one who wanted it most. That was Leopold II, King of Belgium, who was busy building a personal colony in the Congo and needed the other powers to recognize his claim before somebody bigger elbowed him out. 14 states showed up. Germany, France, Britain, Portugal, the US, a handful of smaller European powers, even the Ottomans. Not one African government, kingdom, or delegation was in that room. Not observing, not consulting, not anything. What they actually produced was a document called the General Act. Most of it is about free trade and shipping rights along the Congo and Niger rivers, which sounds boring and honestly is boring, until you get to two articles buried in there that quietly rewired the whole continent's future.
Article 34 said a European power could claim a sphere of influence in Africa as long as it told the other European powers about it. Told them, not the people living there. Article 35 introduced something called effective occupation, which meant, in plain terms, if you plant a flag, post a few officials, and can show you're running things on the ground, your claim holds up against the other Europeans.
Notice what that rule was actually solving for. It wasn't solving how do we deal with Africa. It was solving how do we stop shooting each other over Africa. That's the whole mechanism. Once effective occupation became the standard, every European power had a direct incentive to move fast, plant a post, and lock in territory before a rival did. It turned colonization from something opportunistic into something close to mandatory. If you didn't grab your piece, somebody else would grab it for you, legally, under rules you just signed. Now, before you picture 5 European monarchs high-fiving over a shared master plan, that's not really what this was either. It was messier and, in its own way, dumber. Different companies, different foreign ministries, different domestic pressures back home, all pulling in overlapping directions, occasionally undercutting each other, mostly just racing. The system didn't need a villain twirling a mustache. It just needed a rule that made grabbing land the rational move for everyone at once. Here's the scale of what that rule set off. In the roughly 15 years after Berlin, European claims over African territory exploded. By 1914,
The only two places on the entire continent that weren't under some form of European control were Ethiopia and Liberia. Everyone else got folded in, fast, using the exact legal cover this conference had just handed out.
And the borders that got drawn to formalize all that effective occupation weren't drawn with African communities in mind at all. Because, again, no African voices were in the room to begin with. Straight lines, river midpoints, whatever was administratively convenient. The Iwi people ended up split between what's now Ghana and Togo. Somali communities got carved across 3 separate colonial territories that later became 3 separate countries. None of that was an accident of cartography. It was just nobody involved having a reason to care.
So, back to Jaja.
In September of 1887, just 2.5 years after Berlin wrapped, a British consul named Harry Johnston invited him aboard a British warship, the HMS Goshawk, for what was framed as a friendly negotiation. Jaja went. Once he was on board, they arrested him. The charge, more or less, was that he was obstructing free trade, in violation of the exact spirit of the agreement that had just come out of Berlin. He was shipped off for a trial in Accra, found guilty, and exiled, first to London, eventually to the Caribbean. He died on his way home years later, never having governed Opobo again.
He didn't lose his kingdom in a battle. He lost it in a meeting he was tricked into attending, under a legal framework built specifically to make that kind of takeover clean. That mechanism didn't retire in 1885, it just changed clothes. After African nations won independence in the mid-20th century, the new governments faced a brutal choice about those same colonial borders. Redraw everything to match ethnic and historical lines, and you'd trigger wars across the entire continent, because almost nowhere did colonial borders match those lines, or keep the borders exactly as the colonizers had drawn them, and just try to govern within lines you never chose. In 1964, African leaders formally chose the second option, a principle called uti possidetis juris, meaning roughly keep what you've got. That decision is still load-bearing today. When Cameroon and Nigeria took their dispute over the oil-rich Bakassi Peninsula to the International Court of Justice back in 2002, the court didn't ask which country's people actually lived there or felt connected to it. It looked at old colonial-era boundary agreements between Britain and Germany and ruled based on those. Cameroon won on paper. Thousands of displaced Bakassi residents are still waiting to be properly resettled, and Nigerian and Cameroonian fishers have kept clashing in those waters for years since, sometimes fatally. The court wasn't reaching for a conspiracy. It was just applying the only legal framework anyone had ever agreed to, and that framework traces straight back to a rulebook written in Berlin by people who never set foot in the Delta. Same mechanism, different building, different century, somebody else's paperwork still deciding who belongs where. None of this means Africa's borders were the only thing that mattered, or that everything that's gone wrong since traces cleanly back to one conference in one winter. Plenty of what came after involved choices made by African governments themselves, good and bad, same as anywhere else. But the starting conditions, who got to draw the lines, who got a vote in the room, who got left completely off the guest list, that part is not up for debate. It's right there in the signatures on the General Act.
Jaja spent his whole life proving that an African trader could out-negotiate European merchants on their own turf. He just never got a seat at the one table where the rules of that negotiation actually got written. And once you know that's how the system was built, you start noticing it isn't just history. It's still the framework plenty of modern disputes get settled inside of, whether the people living there had any say in it or not.